but honestly, it's probably a bit beyond my pay grade. On Dirty Jobs, the big lesson was there's an awful lot of people who are doing really important work who nobody really pays affirmative attention to.
Mike Rowe has spent decades doing the jobs most people would rather avoid. From cleaning sewers to processing animal waste, he became the face of Dirty Jobs, a show that somehow managed to turn everyday labor into prime-time television. But behind the humor and hard hat, Mike's journey has been marked by more than mud and machinery. He went from being an opera singer to a television host and finally, a man searching for direction in a changing industry. Why? Because the show that made him famous also pushed him to his physical and emotional limits, leaving behind a trail of injuries, exhaustion, and an abrupt end to everything he'd worked so hard for. This is the heartbreaking tragedy of Mike Rowe. Let's get into it. Humble beginnings, from choir boy to everyman. Before the fame and dirty jobs, Mike Rowe was just another young man trying to figure out what he wanted from life. He was born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1962 to two public school teachers, John and Peggy Rowe. Both were practical, disciplined, and community-minded. The kind of parents who believed in hard work and doing things the right way. Their son, however, was a little different. Mike was curious, restless, and had a knack for talking his way out of trouble. He wasn't the best student, but he was memorable, the kind of kid who could charm a classroom and make even detention seem entertaining. Mike attended Overly High School, where he joined the choir, not because he loved singing, but because he thought that's where the girls were. What started as a casual decision became the first hint of a future in performance. His voice was rich and naturally confident, and under the encouragement of his teacher, Mr. Nizer, Mike began to take it seriously. By graduation, he had performed in plays and musicals, unknowingly laying the foundation for a career built on presence, timing, and charisma. After high school, he went on to Towson University, majoring in communication studies. Like many students, he wasn't sure what he wanted to do, but he knew he wanted to talk. His time at Towson helped him refine that skill, learning not just how to speak, but how to listen, how to observe, and how to tell a story that held attention. All lessons that would later define his television career. After college, however, Mike's professional journey was anything but straightforward. He dabbled in theater, performing with the Baltimore Opera. He hosted small segments for local TV and radio. And although none of it really paid much, it gave him experience in almost every form of communication. Singing, acting, announcing, improvising. He didn't know it at the time, but each of those odd jobs was quietly preparing him for the career-defining one to come. From opera to QVC. For most people, the journey to television fame follows a predictable route: talent, opportunity, and a bit of luck. For Mike, it was nothing like that. His career began quietly, almost invisibly, in the spaces where art and survival overlapped. After graduating from Towson University, Mike didn't head straight for Hollywood or network television. He drifted instead, trying to find where he belonged. He took jobs that paid little and offered less stability, yet each one taught him something new about how to connect with people. One of his first steady roles came through the Baltimore Opera. It might sound glamorous, but for Mike, it was mostly a way to stay busy and keep learning how to perform. The discipline of opera, the timing, posture, and control wasn't something he imagined would ever help him on TV. Still, standing on stage before an audience that expected perfection taught him confidence. It also gave him a deeper respect for the people behind the scenes. The set builders, lighting crew, and costumers whose unrecognized work made every performance possible. That quiet appreciation for overlooked labor would come back around years later in a much bigger way. Between performances, Mike did whatever he could to make ends meet. He recorded voiceovers for commercials and documentaries, often working late into the night. His deep, clear voice made him a natural. But voice acting was hardly steady work. He also appeared in local theater productions and even hosted occasional small-time TV spots around Baltimore. He wasn't famous. He wasn't even close. But each experience gave him a better sense of timing, improvisation, and how to hold attention without trying too hard. In the early 90s, Mike stumbled into a job at QVC, the home shopping network, after auditioning as a dare from a friend. The audition was simple: talk about a pencil for 8 minutes straight without stopping. Most people failed in under 2. Mike turned it into a performance, funny, effortless, unpredictable. The producers were impressed, and he was hired on the spot. It wasn't long before he discovered that live television was its own kind of chaos. For 6 hours a night, he had to talk nonstop about products he barely cared about. Everything from jewelry to vacuums, even collectibles, you name it. But instead of just reading the script, Mike made it entertaining. He joked with callers, poked fun at the items, and sometimes went completely off topic. Viewers loved it, but his managers didn't. He was fired for not taking things seriously, then rehired when ratings dropped, and fired again later for the same reason. Through all that instability, Mike learned something invaluable: how to keep talking when there's nothing left to say. He learned how to make dull moments interesting, how to listen in real time, and how to be authentic under pressure. In hindsight, those late-night QVC shifts were an unlikely boot camp. They taught him that the best stories often come from the unscripted, unpolished corners of life, and that connecting with people doesn't require perfection, just honesty. The birth of dirty jobs. By the early 2000s, Mike had built a rather odd resume: opera singer, voice actor, pitchman, and occasional TV host. He wasn't a celebrity, but he had something better: experience. Years of unpredictable work had taught him to stay composed under pressure, and years of live television had made him quick on his feet. So when an opportunity came to host a short segment on a local San Francisco show called Somebody's Gotta Do It, Mike took it without much thought. The premise was simple: spend a day doing the tough, overlooked jobs that keep society running. It wasn't glamorous, but that was precisely why it worked. In 2003, Discovery Channel noticed the concept. At the time, the network was interested in dabbling in the idea of new unscripted content. They wanted something real, human, and different from the polished reality shows of the time. And that's when Mike's segment caught their eye. It stood out because it wasn't about competition or celebrity. It was about ordinary people doing extraordinary work. It was fresh, unique, and very relatable. So, Discovery took a chance on him, and Dirty Jobs was born. The show premiered in 2005, and within weeks, it was clear that it had tapped into something special. Every episode featured Mike stepping into someone else's boots: sewer inspectors, animal farmers, snake wranglers, and waste collectors. He wasn't there to mock or glorify them. He was there to learn, to work alongside them, and to show audiences the grit and dignity behind each task. It was almost like an antidote to a culture obsessed with convenience and comfort. From the very beginning, Dirty Jobs demanded authenticity. There were no scripts, no retakes, no studio polish. Mike's reactions were genuine: his discomfort, his laughter, and his respect. He wasn't pretending to be one of them. He was showing what it meant to try. And that authenticity became the show's heartbeat. Viewers connected not just with the workers, but with Mike himself, his humility, humor, and unfiltered honesty. But behind the scenes, the work was grueling. Each episode took him into physically demanding, often hazardous environments. He climbed into sewers filled with rats, waded through animal waste, and crawled through spaces so tight they barely fit a camera. He endured bites, bruises, infections, and exhaustion. There were no body doubles or safety rehearsals. If it happened, it happened. And though it made for great television, it took a real toll. Mike later admitted that there were times his body ached for days after filming. The injuries piled up, but he rarely complained. He felt he owed it to the people whose stories he was telling to experience a fraction of what they did daily. Despite the grime and discomfort, Dirty Jobs wasn't really about the mess, but more so about respect. It reminded viewers that behind every clean street, working drain, and stocked shelf, someone was doing a hard, often thankless job. Mike gave those people visibility and dignity. By the end of its first season, the show had become one of Discovery's most beloved programs. To many, it wasn't just another show. It was a statement about work, pride, and the quiet heroism that keeps the world moving. And for Mike, it marked the turning point of his life. A career built not on glamour, but on authenticity. Had he finally found the direction he'd spent decades searching for? The toll behind the camera. For years, audiences watched Mike dive headfirst into some of the dirtiest, most dangerous work imaginable, and he made it look easy. But behind the laughter and quick comebacks, the toll of Dirty Jobs was very real. It wasn't a show that could be filmed safely from a distance. Every scene demanded Mike's full physical presence, and that meant real exposure to risk, exhaustion, and injury. From the start, Dirty Jobs was filmed with minimal planning. The premise relied on spontaneity. Mike and his small crew would arrive on site, meet real workers, and join them in their daily routines. There were no stunt doubles or scripted reactions. When Mike climbed into a tank of waste or wrestled an animal, it was him, unprotected except for basic gear. Over the years, that kind of raw participation left its mark. He's been bitten by snakes, stung by bees, clawed by crabs, burned, bruised, and even briefly knocked unconscious. It wasn't the sort of pain that made headlines, but it added up quietly, episode after episode. Mike once joked that his body had become a collection of minor regrets. But there was some truth behind the humor. The long days of physical labor, often filmed in extreme heat or freezing temperatures, took a real toll. There were no breaks for comfort or glamour. He worked shoulder to shoulder with people whose bodies were accustomed to the strain, while his had to adapt overnight. That meant days of soreness, nights without sleep, and frequent exposure to environments that tested both endurance and sanity. Beyond the physical impact, there was the mental weight of witnessing the harsh realities that most people never see. Dirty Jobs introduced him to workers who endured endless risks for little recognition. Fishermen who lost colleagues at sea, sanitation workers injured on the job, and miners who fought claustrophobia and fear every single day. Mike carried their stories home with him, and even though the show was meant to entertain, it also opened his eyes to the cost of labor in a society that rarely looks down, only up. There were moments when the danger felt too close. During one shoot, he was submerged in a sewer system and lost communication with the crew. Another time, a malfunctioning piece of equipment nearly crushed his hand. He didn't lose any limbs or suffer catastrophic injuries, but the risks were constant. And the reality was simple. If something had gone wrong, there were no special effects to fall back on. The authenticity that made the show powerful also made it dangerous. Still, Mike refused to dramatize his pain. He believed the real story wasn't about him, but about the millions of people who worked like that every day without applause. His goal was to shine a light on them, not on his discomfort. But even he couldn't ignore how much the show had changed him. It taught him humility, respect, and the limits of endurance. He began to see pain not as something to avoid, but as a part of understanding what hard work really means. But just as he started to come to terms with this, his career would take another heartbreaking hit. The end of Dirty Jobs. By 2012, Dirty Jobs had aired for 8 years. spanning hundreds of episodes across all 50 states. It had become one of Discovery Channel's most successful shows, beloved not just for its entertainment, but for its heart. Each episode celebrated ordinary people doing extraordinary work, and Mike had become a trusted voice, funny, humble, and very relatable. But as the years passed, fatigue began to set in. The long hours, the constant travel, and the physical demands were catching up to him. Still, no one expected what came next. That same year, Discovery Channel quietly announced that Dirty Jobs had been canceled. There was no scandal, no on-screen breakdown, no ratings collapse. The network simply decided to move on. For millions of viewers, it felt abrupt. For Mike, it was the kind of loss that couldn't be explained in numbers or contracts. He later described the moment as bittersweet, saying that the show had run its course, but it had also become part of who he was. The cancellation left a void, not just for Mike, but for the audience that saw the show as a rare bridge between entertainment and empathy. He had built genuine relationships with the workers he met, men and women whose stories rarely made it to television. Saying goodbye to that world felt like leaving behind a family. For the first time in years, Mike wasn't sure what came next. In interviews, he admitted that the end of Dirty Jobs hit him harder than expected. He'd built his life around the show's travel schedule, its unpredictable rhythm, and its mission to honor real work. Without it, there was a silence that felt foreign. He also began to realize how much of himself he had given to the series, physically and emotionally. He wasn't injured or broken, but he was tired, and he needed to rest. Still, Mike was not one to stay idle for long. Out of the ashes of Dirty Jobs came a new purpose. He launched Mike Rowe Works, a foundation dedicated to supporting skilled labor and closing the gap between blue-collar work and respect. The organization offered scholarships and funding for trade schools, encouraging young people to see value in the kind of jobs the show had celebrated all along. In a way, it was the show's legacy made real. He also returned to television with Somebody's Gotta Do It, a gentler continuation of the Dirty Jobs spirit, focusing on people driven by passion rather than necessity. It didn't have the same grit or chaos, but it carried the same heart. Through it all, Mike's mission stayed consistent: to challenge the stigma around hard work, and to remind people that every comfort they enjoy comes from someone else's labor. Personal tragedies and private battles. Dirty Jobs made Mike a household name, but very little was known about what went on behind the camera, about the private losses and internal struggles that shaped him. He rarely sought sympathy. Yet, beneath the jokes and steady composure, there were moments of heartbreak and loss that left lasting marks on his life. One such moment as the challenge he faced with his parents' health. Mike's parents, John and Peggy, had always been at the center of his story, two educators who shaped his values and inspired countless anecdotes on Dirty Jobs. They became fan favorites themselves when Mike featured them in videos and online posts, their warmth and humor capturing audiences' hearts. But as they grew older, Mike began confronting the emotional reality of watching his parents age. He's spoken candidly about his father's struggle with recovery after facing a very serious heart attack. On his official website, he shared a heartfelt message written by his mother, Peggy, recounting the terrifying events of late Christmas night. She described how her husband, John, suddenly woke up sweating profusely and in excruciating pain in his chest and arms. "I remember screaming into the phone," she wrote, recalling the chaos of the moment, then feeling pure terror when the EMT shouted, "Stay with me, John! Stay with me!" 4 days later, Peggy expressed deep gratitude for what she called their good fortune, noting that nearly half of all heart attack victims never make it to the hospital alive. She went on to thank the medical team, particularly the interventionalist who performed the heart catheterization and placed 3 stents in John's arteries, which had been up to 95 to 98% blocked. "And thanks to our kids for their support," she added warmly. "It's comforting to know they still like us." Mike has admitted that dealing with those changes was harder than anything he ever faced on the job. Physical exhaustion was one thing. Emotional endurance was another. He described it as learning to work in reverse, where instead of building something, he was watching parts of his life quietly dismantle themselves. There were also quieter battles, moments of personal doubt that followed Dirty Jobs' cancellation. Though Mike stayed busy with his foundation and public work, the transition from being constantly on the road to staying still was jarring. He later revealed that he struggled with the shift in identity. For nearly a decade, he had been the guy who does dirty jobs. When that ended, he had to rediscover who Mike Rowe was without the grime, without the cameras, and without the constant motion that had defined his life. Yet, through all of it, Mike never stopped sharing his experiences with honesty. Today, he uses his platform to talk about the everyday resilience that allows people to keep going after loss, change, and uncertainty. What do you think of Mike's heartbreaking tragedy? Tell us in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this.